At 3 in the morning, Brandon settled in at the back of the bus, watching out the window as the town passed him by in a whirl. It was a cold night, he could tell from out of the frosty window. The vehicle came to a stop, and Brandon looked around confusedly. There was no one else on the bus but him. Not many people rode the bus so early, but on the other hand, there weren't many people in Twin Creek to begin with. There never were. The person who stepped onto the bus didn't look right to Brandon. He had disheveled hair and was limping on a mangled stump of a leg. It was bloody and was missing a pant leg. He had globe-like eyes that seemed to revolve around inside his head. He had a stupid, drunken look to his face, lips clenching and unclenching as if he was nervous. The female bus driver recoiled away from him as if slapped. "Sir, you're—" The man grabbed at her chestnut hair with a gnarled fist. He yanked her forward into her steering wheel, and she gave out a horrid cry. He broke into a grin, and Brandon could see sharp teeth like a lion's. When he opened his mouth, a good amount of standing blood seeped out over his ruffled ski jacket. He reached with his other hand, and Brandon saw that he was missing all his fingers but one. The man grabbed her around the chin and squeezed. Her cries were muffled as a series of cracks and pops lit up her lower face. Pieces of bone poked from her chin, and she became bug-eyed, blood dripping off her nostrils from when she connected with the steering wheel. Brandon sprang up from his seat, his thighs smacking across the seat's padding. The creature didn't notice Brandon at all. He continued to slam the woman's face into the windshield and bent over, fangs dangling. Then Brandon screamed, quickly covering his mouth with his hands. The man turned toward the sound, the woman crying through her dead mouth. His eyes stopped, Brandon dead in his tracks. His eyes were a deep gray, reflecting not even a sliver of light. Brandon tried to scream, but felt his lips being sewn shut. The man in the ski jacket started to approach Brandon, tongue hanging out of his head. The man tossed the bus driver aside, where she fell into the stairwell. She came halfway out of the bus before another man stepped inside, pulling her with him. This man looked like a skinhead. He had an orange bandana across his head, stained red, and green sunglasses over his eyes. But Brandon knew they were gray behind those shades, just like the man in the ski jacket. He threw the woman over the first seat, where she fell into the hard padding, wedging herself between the seat and the floor. Still, she screamed through her locked jaws. The skinhead looked at Brandon, and then at the man in the ski jacket. He sat down in the open driver's seat, adjusting the seat like he had driven a bus a million times, and tilting the rear-view mirror to the correct angle. The man in the ski jacket advanced on Brandon with a quickened pace. He grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and pulled him towards his rotting mouth. The tongue sucked back into his face like a vacuum, his eyes rotating again like spinning gray globes. "Are you Brandon Erickson?" the man asked through a mouthful of blood. His teeth were stained yellow from the blood, but the fangs at the top of his mouth were spotless. "The Brandon that works at the gas station." Without a thought, Brandon nodded his head. The pressure in his head was tight as he felt the man's arms wrap around his back. "We must go there now," Brandon heard inside his head. "You must take us there now." "Why?" he asked back. It would seem that conversing with the stranger inside his head was perfectly natural. It was as if he had done it thousands of times before. Stranger still, Brandon felt himself begin to relax. That is best way to make sure no one gets out. No one gets out of here," the man hissed. "Out of where?" "Twin Creek," the man explained. "No one gets out of Twin Creek." Then the man's eyes burned like an out-of-control wildfire. Brandon's head felt like a plump pincushion, but that was okay. That felt just fine because the eyes seemed to tell him that everything was going to be just fine. They told him that Twin Creek was going under some slight renovation, but it was all for the best. Everything was going to be perfect. "I need to get to the hospital," Brandon thought. The man grinned as he bent over Brandon. "We can manage that," he seemed to say. "This is a bus, you know." The skinhead seemed to hear this because he smiled too, wrenching the bus into drive. He closed the door with one yank of a lever. He hit the gas and the bus was rolling again, and the man behind the wheel knew precisely where to go. They took off through cluttered roads where dead cars and bodies littered the pavement and sidewalks. "You know," the man said to him, "you have to look the part if you're going to the hospital." The ski jacket man opened his mouth and bit down on Brandon's nose. Without a scream of pain, the man wrenched backward with Brandon's nose in his mouth. He chewed on it like a piece of candy. Brandon remained sprawled across the back seat with his limp body tucked under him. Blood seeped down from the red crater in his face into large pools on the floor. He even wore a smile. The hospital was swimming with people. The main road was so jammed with cars that the bus had to physically ram a few blockades and a horrible crunch of metal. Everyone had seen what was happening in downtown Twin Creek. It was some kind of plague or sickness, causing the people to lose their minds and react violently. So far, no one had gotten out of Twin Creek due to the pileup of cars on the main road. Some people got out of their cars to push or roll the blockades out of the way, but there were beasts lurking in every alleyway, and no one was safe. The city bus parked at the curb in front of the ER, where people were being restrained into gurneys, and where nurses and doctors tried to keep the crowds ordered. Somewhere a gun fired, and the crowd jumped. Brandon stumbled out of the bus with a bright pain in his face, like a steel cattle prod easing into his flesh. He shook out of his daze, unsure as to where he was or how much time had passed. With a drunken determination, he cut through the hysterical people to get to the front of the building, toward the automatic doors. A nurse at the entrance tried to direct the oncoming flow of people, and she noticed Brandon's gruesome appearance. She motioned for another paramedic to take him. Brandon pushed the paramedic away with amazing strength and filed inside the ER, holding his face. He was faintly aware of the blood pouring through his fingers. Inside the chaos of the lobby, patients were being either treated or restrained. A male nurse rushed past Brandon, screaming that he was bit. Blood pumped from his neck, and his arm was cut off by the elbow. 2 doctors ran after him and tackled him to the ground. Brandon could faintly hear the far-off scream of the nurse, and then the doctors screamed. He heard the blare of a siren, and then dozens of people were storming down the clogged hallways, pushing past the wall-to-wall gurneys and screaming people. Brandon ducked into the waiting area, where people were taking refuge. Some were passed out on the uncomfortable seats. Men and women alike were elbow to elbow, butt to butt. Children had their faces plastered to the windows, looking down upon the city, dying beneath them. Brandon could see faint streaks of smoke drifting off from select neighborhoods, where house fires were surely raging. He could see the glint and sparkle of the ocean of cars, waiting to exit the town. Brandon proceeded through the doors into the emergency room. Delirious from the onslaught of people, Brandon swept on, unnoticed. He could remember why he was there. The shaman's daughter. He had to find her and make this right. He rounded the last corner, only to stumble upon a pile of dead people. They were leaning against the walls in bloody streaks and sticking half in and out of the open elevator doors. They were all civilians. A man wielding a shotgun leaned against the opposite wall, hands dripping with blood. He was wearing a nurse's uniform, and his scrubs were drenched red. There was a man stirring to the left, but he went unnoticed. "Oh, God!" Brandon screamed, pushing past the mounds of dead corpses. The nurse turned toward him, the gun pointed at his chest. He suddenly looked ashamed. "I just wanted to get past them," the nurse murmured. "I tried to make them relax, but—" Brandon glanced again at the bodies spilled across the floor. There were innards and blood painted on the walls, and gaping holes shot into the plaster and elevator doors. The nearest wall-length window was shattered, allowing the wind to blow at the nurse's loose clothing and at Brandon's wet hair. "Here," the nurse said, tossing the shotgun to Brandon's feet. "I don't need it anymore. I don't need any of this anymore." The nurse turned to the window and looked out, his back to Brandon. "No!" Brandon darted forward, kicking at a bleeding torso at his heel. "If you're smart, you'll get out of this too, before those bastards get you," he said. He then leaned all his weight forward. He toppled out the 5th-floor window to collide with the crowd of people and cars below. There was a series of screams and shouts from below, but Brandon went away from the window. He wiped the blood from his face, picking up the shotgun thoughtfully. Right as he did that, 5 men broke through another set of double doors, all covered in blood. One was a little girl, and she clutched at a black teddy bear, still smoking as if burned. She hissed at Brandon with her black hole for a mouth, blood spinning out in red driplets. They all advanced on him, stepping lightly over the corpses that decorated the floor. Brandon didn't look into their eyes. He raised the shotgun and fired until it was dead in his hands. The creatures collapsed in a heap. Brandon was able to peg 4 of them directly in the chests, blowing the rib cages wide open. The little girl was the only one left, though Brandon had already severed one side of her pelvis from her body. She hobbled at him, still hissing, teddy bear swinging from her side. Brandon hesitated, but found the strength to fight. He gathered his breath and threw his spent weapon at her. She fell on her back with a horrible crunch. He kicked open the double doors behind him and pushed through the delirious crowd. At the end of the hall, he heard another belching cry, and people streamed past him, away from the end of the wing. Yet Brandon pressed on. He thought he probably wouldn't make it, but he knew he had to try. He reached the end of the hall and heard the animal screams, but it didn't matter anymore. Everyone in that town was dead, and he could be sure that she was too. At the end of the hall, the large Mexican from the bar stepped out of one of the rooms to stand directly in front of Brandon. He no longer looked aged. His face was smooth, as if cut from stone, eyes glowing orange. His hair swung in a wild fan across his shoulders. Right before Brandon's eyes, he seemed to grow in height. For the second time that morning, Brandon became mesmerized in the man's eyes, and his muscles went loose. The man pointed a crooked finger inside the open room. Brandon saw a woman lying there in a hospital bed, peaceful yet unmoving. Her chest did not rise or fall. The machinery beside her bed remained cold and unresponsive. "I promise you die last," the man said, "and you will. Now, get back to the bus. You have a show to finish, gas man." Brandon nodded his head slowly and turned around on his heels, cutting through the carnage like Moses through the waters. Later that morning, the bus arrived at the gas station, swinging into a parking lot. The doors opened and the passengers shuffled out, grinning mouths full of red teeth. Brandon and the man in the ski jacket were the last to step out. The man pointed his finger at Twin Creek's main road, just a mile from the station and down the hill. Brandon could see the cars weren't going anywhere, and that people had further clogged the road, struggling to claw their way out. "If this blows, they'll go with it," the ski jacket man said inside Brandon's head. "No one gets out," Brandon agreed, with a slow nod. The ski jacket man nodded with his mouth wide open. "What am I to do?" Brandon asked. "The keys. Get the keys and point us to the trucks." "The trucks?" "The trucks that carry the ship gasoline," Ski Jacket Man replied. "Get the keys for the tanks under us. Everything goes." The man lifted his gangly arms in the simulation of an explosion. Brandon proceeded into the abandoned gas station and came back with a ring of keys. With a broken smile, Brandon selected one of the keys from the ring. It was always the largest key on the ring. The ski jacket man turned toward Brandon. His eyes were sparkling orange. Brandon nodded and held the key up for them both to see. "The trucks," the ski jacket man barked. "Where are the trucks?" "Out back, behind the locked fence. There's only one," Brandon announced. The man nodded and swept his arm at the panel at their feet. There was a single panel in the ground with a direct link to the main tank, which was filled every day or so by a large diesel truck. "Take this pistol. Finish it," the man commanded, tossing a gun at Brandon's chest. Then the ski jacket man led his army toward the locked fence, where they would find the oil truck. Brandon noticed that most of them carried pistols. That was how they were going to set off the truck. He knew what to do with his own weapon. "No one leaves," Brandon muttered, with a voice that was no longer his own. Behind him, the creatures had peeled open the locked fence and were climbing in. They hissed delightfully, guns held at arm's length. Brandon found the main panel, camouflaged with the cold concrete. He found the keyhole at the edge of the panel. He pressed the key in and unlocked it, wrenching the plate open. He peered down at the nozzle, soldered into the top of the tank. He knew there was immense pressure inside the tank, and once he took off the double-plated nozzle, there would be a fountain of cool, flammable liquid. Standing erect, he cocked and aimed his pistol at the tank under his feet. On the road, he could hear the beep, car horns, and the screeching of tires. "Are you ready?" "Yes." Brandon fired into the darkness, and the nozzle rocketed into the sky with immense pressure. He fell back just in time to watch the gasoline pour out in a massive jet of liquid. It didn't take long for it to catch fire, reducing the fountain to an erupting volcano. The molten flames curled around his boots, causing them to melt and catch fire. There were 5 more gunshots, and then there was silence. The tank exploded underneath Brandon's feet, and he was thrown into the air, long tails of fire curling around him. The truck blew up a second later. The ski jacket man disintegrated beneath his flaking coat. The rest of the monsters were torn apart in the enormous explosion, the fragments of twisted steel pinwheeling through the air, already clogged with soot. A steel piece of the tank burst upward out of the ground in a jolt of crumbling asphalt and fire. The remains of the truck spiraled into the air in a line of ash and smoke. A mushroom fireball burst into the sky like a blooming flower. That quickly faded to reveal a gaping skull of black smoke. Twin Creek's main road was torn apart. The cars were rocked off the street with the helpless beings inside. The airborne cars smashed with the storefronts and gift shops. Smoke poured out of the crater that once was a gas station. No one even had the chance to scream before the cars in the road went up like bottle rockets. Still, several limbs and jagged metal fell from the sky. Blood poured down like acid rain. The hospital rocked on its foundation. All the windows on the west side facing the explosion shattered, and the people were thrust backward with such force. The sky had gone red with fire and soot, and the clouds swirled above the curling smoke. A flaming truck struck the Twin Creek clock tower, which crumbled in a cloud of dust and brick. For only a moment, unseen to everyone in Twin Creek, two massive eyes opened in the clouds, shining with red light darker than the fires below. Back at the apartment, Phoebe watched the sun rise in the east. She was standing upon her condo balcony. She looked down at the road, waiting for Brandon to return. It was her suspicion that he had gone back to the hospital to check on the woman. She would have gone out herself if it weren't for the reports on the news. A man had been found at a nearby construction site, convulsing violently. He said he was bitten on the neck and was covered in black bruises. But what baffled her the most was that the worker had been reported dead earlier that afternoon. Just around sundown, the man had to be restrained to a stretcher, and that hadn't been the last report. Before she lost complete power in the apartment, she bit down on her nails. "Where are you?" she asked the sky, which she noticed was filling with dark clouds. She looked back inside the apartment, where her paintings leaned against the wall by the door, her paint sets and brushes spread out across the carpet. Seeing her paintings hanging upside down on the wall had been too much for her, and she hadn't wasted a minute in tearing them down one by one. Two police cruisers sped by the apartment building, lights flashing, horns blaring. She frowned to herself. Then she heard an enormous explosion on the other side of town. A black stack of smoke invaded the sky, and Phoebe screamed. She was about to run back inside when she spotted Brandon on the street, striding toward the front of the building. He still wore his work coveralls and boots. Where his car was, she didn't know, but he was there, walking calmly. Phoebe found her breath again. Her eyes flitted to the brushes on the floor, and then down at the top of her boyfriend's head as it ducked inside the building. Only seconds later, too fast for any human, Brandon opened the door and walked inside the apartment. She felt pins sting uncomfortably against her chest. They lived on the 5th floor of their building, and it didn't have an elevator. There was Brandon, but he had changed somewhere in the seconds between the street and her door. His black hair was clotted with blood, and his work uniform hung off in charred rags, revealing black flesh underneath. He seemed to be smoking. His arms hung loosely at his sides, and he had his head pointed toward the ground. He was barefoot, and there were long shards of glass protruding from the top of his foot. His red hand shut the door behind him with a loud slam. His face reared up in her direction, and she saw that his nose was missing, painting most of his face black with blood. His eyes were literally bugging out of their sockets, red from the smoke and bleeding. Phoebe screeched and drew back, stepping out onto the balcony. Brandon's cheek was sliced open, and Phoebe could see into his mouth. His tongue moved steadily behind blood-stained teeth. One fang stuck out of his cheek like a walrus tooth. His eyes were what scared Phoebe the most. They seemed to sneak into her head and push around at the thoughts inside. She could hear his heavy breathing, but it was in her mind. She could also hear him whispering something inside, restlessly prodding away at her thoughts. The whispering stopped and the laughing commenced. This was not the laughter of the man she loved. What she heard inside her brain was like a power drill, harsh and powerful. "You had something to tell me, honey?" the man said through his elongated fangs. They dripped blood onto the carpet. She muttered something, but he cut her off. "Shut up. Let me talk for once. And don't you even think of interrupting me," the thing hissed. "I don't." Phoebe's eyes rolled as the alien fingers sorted through her mind. She felt them pulling, picking at her brains. Phoebe felt her mind go to mush. In her head she screamed. The creature smiled, its teeth elongating like tusks inside its cheeks. The laughing started up again in Phoebe's head. "Brandon, whatever you are—" "Please, darling, don't be upset," it cackled, reaching down to the ground for a paintbrush. "It's 7 o'clock, honey. I'm tired." Phoebe looked up and saw Brandon approaching her with the blunt end of the paintbrush. "Please, Phoebe, don't be like this," it continued. It came within 2 feet of Phoebe and whipped backward as soon as the sunlight shined in its eyes. Brandon hissed. Its eyes reduced themselves to small red holes in its skull. Phoebe saw her moment and leapt to her bare feet. She tried to circle around Brandon to reach the door. He snatched at her with incredible speed. Its hand wrapped around Phoebe's neck and threw her into the opposite wall, into one of her canvas paintings. The painting snapped into 2 pieces as Phoebe struck the wall. In a flash, Brandon was on her, and with teeth inside her neck. Her first instinct was to grab at the hand that wielded the paintbrush. She held it back, but the end of the brush handle was inches from her eyeball. The thing struck at her with its other hand. The sharp nails scratched across her cheek, immediately drawing beads of blood. She was able to overpower the hand and wrench the brush from its wet fingers. She then drove the blunt end into Brandon's left eye. There was a squishing sound, and then it lodged into something stiff and wet. She was sprayed with hot juice. "You bitch! You fucking bitch!" She shoved him as hard as she could off her, and he tumbled into the wooden banister behind him. Before she could pull herself off the floor, Brandon was already on his feet, bent over and hissing. At that, she sprang at the balcony in front of her, palms out and ready, her entire body strength swelling up rapidly. Phoebe screamed, connecting her hands with his chest. She shoved him hard, and the railing gave out behind him, sending him falling through space. Brandon disappeared from view, and then there was a tremendous crack as he collided with the pavement 5 stories below. His head had smashed like a melon, the brush still protruding from the bloody mass. His broken legs lay twisted, his fist still clutching at the brush handle. Phoebe didn't see him fall. She fell backward against the screen door, gasping for air. She looked down at her shirt, now stained red from the wound in her neck. She hit the floor and crawled toward her artwork, askew on the carpet. Before she died, she looked into a painting she'd based on a chilling dream she once had. Now it made sense to her. Her hand touched the delicate canvas as she realized what it was of. "Twin Creek," she murmured. The painting depicted a glorious mountainside. The grass on the hill was dead, and the mountainside was covered in dark shadows from a black cloud in the sky. In the clouds were 2 red eyes that seemed to watch over the darkness. She had titled the painting, "The Curse." Her head fell over on her arm, and her palm slid from the canvas, revealing a dripping handprint of blood.